The morning sun shone through the tall windows of the Providence Municipal Court as people started to fill the wooden benches. It was Tuesday just after 9 a.m. and the court was getting ready for another busy day. The old building had seen thousands of cases over the years. Its walls were painted a soft yellow color, and the floors creaked when people walked across them. Judge Frank Caprio walked into the courtroom wearing his black robe. He was 77 years old, but he still moved with energy and purpose. His gray hair was neat and his eyes showed kindness behind his glasses. Frank had been a judge for 37 years. In all that time, he had never lost his love for helping people. The people in the courtroom watched him take his seat behind the big wooden desk at the front. This desk was called the bench, and it was where Judge Caprio made all his decisions. He looked out at the crowd and smiled. He always did this. It made people feel a little less scared about being in court. "Good morning, everyone," Judge Caprio said in his warm voice. "Let's have a good day together." The courtroom was full of different kinds of people. There were men in work clothes who had gotten speeding tickets on their way to job sites. There were women in business suits who had parked in the wrong spots downtown. There were young people who had made mistakes and older people who had forgotten to renew their car registration. Some people were there with their families. Wives sat next to husbands. Children sat quietly next to their parents. Everyone was nervous. Going to court always made people nervous, even for small things like parking tickets. But this was not just any courtroom. This was Judge Caprio's courtroom, and it was famous all over the country. Videos of his cases were watched by millions of people online. People loved watching him because he was different from other judges. He listened to people's stories. He cared about their problems. He tried to help them instead of just punishing them. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, stood near the judge's bench. He had worked with Judge Caprio for 15 years. He knew that this judge was special. Officer Rodriguez had seen other judges who were mean or cold. Judge Caprio was never like that. He treated everyone with respect, no matter who they were or what they had done. "First case," called the court clerk, Mrs. Patterson. She had worked in the court for 20 years. She had gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. She knew every person who came through these doors, and she remembered their stories. The people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. Some looked at the papers in their hands. These papers told them when their cases would be called. Everyone hoped their case would go well. Everyone hoped Judge Caprio would be kind to them. Near the back of the courtroom sat a man in an expensive suit. His name was Richard Walsh, and he was 45 years old. He owned a successful business in Providence. He had money and power, and he was used to getting his way. Richard had a parking ticket, and he was angry about it. He thought the ticket was wrong, and he did not want to pay it. Richard looked around the courtroom with annoyance. He checked his expensive watch several times. He had important business meetings to attend. He did not want to waste his time in this courtroom with these people. He thought he was better than them. In the front row sat a young woman named Maria Santos. She was 28 years old and had a 6-year-old daughter. Maria worked 2 jobs to support her family, but money was always tight. She had gotten a ticket for driving with expired car registration. She could not afford to renew it because she had lost one of her jobs 3 months ago. Maria held her purse tightly in her lap. Inside the purse was all the money she had left until her next paycheck. It was not much. If she had to pay the fine for her ticket, she would not have enough money to buy groceries for her daughter. She looked at Judge Caprio and hoped he would understand her situation. The courtroom had about 50 people in it that morning. Each person had their own story. Each person had their own reasons for being there. Some had made honest mistakes. Some had been in difficult situations. A few had simply not been paying attention to the rules. Judge Caprio knew that every person who came to his courtroom was dealing with something in their life. He had learned this over his many years as a judge. He had seen single mothers struggling to feed their children. He had seen elderly people who could barely afford their medicine. He had seen young people who had made one bad choice and were trying to get their lives back on track. This is why Judge Caprio was different. He did not just look at the ticket or the law. He looked at the person. He asked questions about their life. He wanted to understand what had happened and why. Sometimes he would dismiss the fine completely. Sometimes he would reduce it to an amount the person could afford. Sometimes he would give people time to pay or let them do community service instead. The local newspaper had written many stories about Judge Caprio. They called him the most compassionate judge in America. Television news shows had done reports about his courtroom. People from other states would drive to Providence just to watch him work. But Judge Caprio never let the fame change him. He still lived in the same house he had lived in for 30 years. He still ate lunch at the same small restaurant near the courthouse. He still remembered what it was like to grow up in a working-class family in Providence. His father had been a milkman who worked hard every day to support his family. His mother had worked in a factory. They had taught him that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. They had taught him that sometimes people needed help, not punishment. As Judge Caprio sat at his bench that Tuesday morning, he had no idea that this day would be different from all the others. He did not know that before the morning was over, someone would insult him in front of the entire courtroom. He did not know that he would have to show everyone why respect and kindness were so important. The morning was just beginning, and already the courtroom was full of stories waiting to be told. Mrs. Patterson looked at her list and called out the first name. Maria Santos, case number 2024 TR5847. Maria Santos stood up slowly from her seat in the front row. Her hands were shaking a little as she walked to the front of the courtroom. She wore a simple blue dress that she had bought at a discount store 2 years ago. It was the nicest dress she owned, and she had ironed it carefully that morning. Maria had never been in court before. She did not know what to expect. Her heart was beating fast as she approached the wooden podium, where defendants stood to speak to the judge. She looked up at Judge Caprio, who was looking back at her with gentle eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Santos," Judge Caprio said warmly.
"How are you today?"
"I'm okay, Your Honor," Maria replied quietly. Her voice was so soft that people in the back of the courtroom had to lean forward to hear her. Judge Caprio picked up the papers that told him about Maria's case. He read them carefully. According to the police report, Maria had been stopped 3 weeks ago while driving her car. The police officer had discovered that her car registration had expired 4 months earlier. In Rhode Island, driving with expired registration was against the law. "I see here that Officer Johnson stopped you on Broad Street," Judge Caprio said. "Can you tell me what happened that day?" Maria took a deep breath. She had practiced what she would say, but now that she was standing in front of the judge, her mind felt blank. She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at Judge Caprio. "My daughter Emma was sick," Maria began. "She had a high fever and I was scared. I called her doctor and they told me to bring her to the emergency room right away. I put her in the car and drove as fast as I could to Rhode Island Hospital." Judge Caprio nodded. He had heard many stories over the years, but he could tell that Maria was telling the truth. He could see the worry in her eyes when she talked about her daughter. "How old is Emma?" Judge Caprio asked. "She's 6 years old," Maria answered. "She's my only child. Her father left when she was 2, so it's just me and her." The courtroom was very quiet now. People were listening to Maria's story. Even Richard Walsh, who had been checking his phone, looked up to listen. "What happened at the hospital?" Judge Caprio asked gently. "The doctor said Emma had pneumonia," Maria explained. "They kept her in the hospital for 3 days. I stayed with her the whole time. I was so worried that something terrible would happen to her." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she remembered those scary days. She wiped them away with the back of her hand. "When we were driving home from the hospital, that's when the police officer stopped me," Maria continued. "I had completely forgotten about renewing my car registration. I had been so focused on taking care of Emma and working my jobs that it slipped my mind." Judge Caprio leaned forward in his chair. "Tell me about your work, Mrs. Santos." "I have 2 jobs," Maria said. "During the day, I clean offices downtown. At night, I work at a diner washing dishes. I work about 60 hours a week. That's a lot of work," Judge Caprio observed. "What happened with your car registration?" Maria looked embarrassed. "I lost my day job 3 months ago. The company I worked for went out of business. I couldn't afford to renew my registration or my car insurance. I know I should have, but I had to choose between that and buying food for Emma." The judge nodded, understanding. He had heard similar stories many times before. He knew that sometimes people had to make impossible choices between following the law and taking care of their families. "Did you find another day job?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor. I found the office cleaning job 2 weeks ago. It doesn't pay as much as my old job, but it's something. I'm trying to catch up on all my bills." Judge Caprio looked at the papers again. The fine for driving with expired registration was $85. For most people, that might not seem like a lot of money, But for Maria, who was working 2 jobs and struggling to pay for food and medicine for her daughter, $85 was a huge amount. "Mrs. Santos, do you have your car registration renewed now?" Judge Caprio asked. "Yes, sir," Maria replied. "As soon as I got my first paycheck from the new job, I went and renewed it. I also got insurance again. I never want to drive without proper papers again." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder with her new registration and insurance papers. She handed them to the bailiff, who brought them to Judge Caprio. The judge looked at the papers and saw that everything was in order. Maria had done what she needed to do to follow the law. She had renewed her registration and gotten insurance for her car. "I can see that you've taken care of everything," Judge Caprio said. "That shows me that you're a responsible person who cares about following the rules." Maria nodded. "I try to do the right thing, Your Honor. I just sometimes don't have enough money to do everything at once." Judge Caprio understood. He had grown up in a family that didn't have much money. He remembered his parents having to decide which bills to pay first. He remembered times when there wasn't enough food in the house. "How is Emma doing now?" he asked. Maria's face brightened for the first time since she had entered the courtroom. "She's much better, thank you for asking. She's back in school and playing with her friends again. The medicine the doctors gave her really helped." "I'm glad to hear that," Judge Caprio said. "Being a single mother is one of the hardest jobs in the world. You're doing a good job taking care of your daughter." Maria felt tears coming to her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. She had expected the judge to be angry with her for breaking the law. Instead, he was being kind and understanding. The people in the courtroom were watching this conversation with interest. Many of them had children of their own. They understood what Maria was going through. They knew how hard it was to balance work and family and money, but not everyone in the courtroom was feeling sympathy for Maria. Richard Walsh was getting more and more annoyed as he listened to her story. He looked at his expensive watch again and sighed loudly. He had his own case to deal with, and he didn't want to listen to what he thought was a sob story. Judge Caprio was still looking at Maria with compassion. He was thinking about what the right thing to do would be. The law said that Maria should pay the fine, but the law also gave judges the power to use their judgment in certain situations. This was one of those situations where Judge Caprio would have to decide what justice really meant. Judge Caprio sat quietly for a moment, thinking about everything Maria had told him. He had been a judge for 37 years, and in all that time he had learned to tell when people were telling the truth. Maria was definitely telling the truth. He looked at her standing there in her simple blue dress, holding her purse tightly. She was trying to be brave, but he could see that she was scared. She was scared about the fine she might have to pay. She was scared about how she would take care of her daughter if she had to spend money she didn't have. "Mrs. Santos," Judge Caprio said gently, "I want you to know that I understand your situation. Being a single mother is not easy. Working 2 jobs to support your family takes a lot of courage." Maria looked up at him with hope in her eyes. She had heard that Judge Caprio was different from other judges, but she hadn't dared to hope that he would really understand her problems. "You made a mistake by letting your registration expire," the judge continued. "But I can see that you made this mistake because you were focused on taking care of your sick daughter. That tells me a lot about what kind of person you are." The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone was listening to every word Judge Caprio said. Even the court reporter, who was used to typing everything that was said in court, found herself paying extra attention to this case. "When your daughter got sick, you didn't hesitate to get in your car and drive her to the hospital," Judge Caprio said. "You didn't think about your expired registration. You thought about saving your child's life. That's what any good parent would do." Tears started rolling down Maria's cheeks. She had been so worried that the judge would think she was a bad person for breaking the law. Instead, he was telling her that she was a good mother. "I also see that as soon as you got your first paycheck from your new job, you went and renewed your registration." Judge Caprio continued. "You got insurance for your car. You did everything you needed to do to make things right. That shows me that you respect the law and you want to do the right thing." Maria nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I never want to break the law again. I just didn't have the money at the time." Judge Caprio understood. He had seen this situation many times before. Good people sometimes had to choose between following every rule and taking care of their families. It wasn't fair, but it was reality for many working families. "Mrs. Santos, I'm going to do something for you today," Judge Caprio said. "I'm dismissing this case completely." "You don't have to pay any fine," Maria's mouth fell open. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Really?" she whispered. "Really," Judge Caprio confirmed with a smile. "You've already been punished enough by worrying about your daughter's health and struggling to make ends meet. You don't need to pay a fine on top of all that." The people in the courtroom started to smile. Some of them clapped quietly. They were happy for Maria. They knew she needed a break, and Judge Caprio had given her one. "Thank you so much, Your Honor," Maria said through her tears. "You don't know what this means to me and Emma." "I think I do know," Judge Caprio replied. "I grew up in a family that didn't have much money. I know what it's like to have to make hard choices. Sometimes we all need a little help." Judge Caprio wasn't finished yet. He had more to say to Maria. "I want you to remember something," he told her. "You are not alone in this world. There are people who care about you and want to help you succeed. You're working hard to take care of your daughter, and that's something to be proud of." Maria was crying openly now, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. She had come to court expecting to leave with less money than she had started with. Instead, she was leaving with hope. "Your Honor," Maria said, "I promise I will never let my registration expire again. I will always try to follow the law." "I believe you will," Judge Caprio said, "and I want you to know that if you ever need help with anything, there are resources available. The court clerk, Mrs. Patterson, can give you information about programs that might be able to help you with things like food, health care, or job training." Mrs. Patterson nodded and made a note to herself to give Maria some information after court was over. "Sometimes life gives us more than we can handle," Judge Caprio said, looking directly at Maria. "When that happens, it's okay to let other people help you carry the load. You don't have to do everything by yourself." These words touched everyone in the courtroom, even some of the tough-looking men who were there for their own traffic violations found themselves getting emotional. "Take care of yourself and Emma," Judge Caprio told Maria. "And remember that you're a good mother doing your best in a difficult situation." Maria walked back to her seat feeling like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The $85 fine would have meant choosing between paying the electric bill or buying groceries. Now she could do both. The people sitting near Maria patted her on the back and whispered congratulations. They were genuinely happy for her. Most of them knew what it was like to struggle with money and worry about their families. Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff, had seen Judge Caprio show compassion many times before, but it still made him proud to work in this courtroom. He knew that Maria would tell this story to her daughter someday. She would tell Emma about the judge who understood that sometimes good people need help instead of punishment. The court reporter had typed every word of what had just happened, but she also knew that the real impact of Judge Caprio's decision couldn't be captured in a transcript. The kindness he had shown Maria would ripple out into the community in ways that couldn't be measured. Judge Caprio looked out at the rest of the people in the courtroom. "This is what we're here for," he said to everyone. "We're here to find the best way to handle each situation. Sometimes that means punishment. Sometimes it means understanding and compassion." Most of the people in the courtroom nodded in agreement. They understood that Judge Caprio was trying to make the court system work for regular people, not just for rich people who could afford expensive lawyers. But there was one person in the courtroom who was not happy with what had just happened. Richard Walsh was sitting in the back and his face was getting red with anger. He thought Judge Caprio was being too soft. He thought Maria should have had to pay the fine just like everyone else. He didn't care about her sick daughter or her money problems. He thought the law was the law and everyone should be treated exactly the same way. Richard looked at his watch again. He had been sitting in this courtroom for almost an hour, and only one case had been heard. At this rate, he would be here all day. He had important business to take care of, and he was getting more frustrated by the minute. Judge Caprio called for the next case, not knowing that the man in the expensive suit in the back row was about to cause a scene that would change everything. Richard Walsh had been getting angrier with every minute that passed. He checked his gold watch for the 10th time in an hour. It was now 10:30 a.m., and he had been sitting in this courtroom since 9:15. He had a meeting with important clients at 11:30, and at this rate he was going to be late. Richard owned 3 successful restaurants in Providence. He employed over 50 people and made more money in a month than most people in this courtroom made in a year. He was used to having people listen to him and do what he wanted. He was not used to waiting around for other people. As he watched Judge Caprio dismiss Maria's case, Richard felt his anger building up inside him. He couldn't understand why the judge would let someone off the hook for breaking the law. In Richard's mind, rules were rules and everyone should follow them no matter what their personal situation was. "This is ridiculous," Richard muttered under his breath. The woman sitting next to him heard him and looked over with a frown. She had been moved by Maria's story and was happy that Judge Caprio had helped her. Richard didn't care what the woman thought. He was tired of sitting here listening to sob stories. He had his own case to deal with. 3 weeks ago, he had gotten a parking ticket while having lunch at a restaurant downtown. He had parked in a loading zone for 15 minutes while he ate. The parking meter officer had given him a $75 ticket. Richard believed the ticket was unfair. He argued that the loading zone sign was hard to see, and that he was only parked there for a short time. He had decided to fight the ticket in court instead of just paying it. It wasn't about the money. $75 was nothing to him. It was about the principle. But now, after sitting here for over an hour, Richard was starting to think he had made a mistake. He could have just paid the ticket and gotten on with his life. Instead, he was wasting his valuable time in this courtroom, watching Judge Caprio give away free passes to people who had broken the law. Mrs. Patterson called the next case. James Mitchell, case number 2024 TR 6091. A man in his 60s walked to the front of the courtroom. He was wearing work boots and a flannel shirt. His hands were dirty from his job at a construction site. James had gotten a speeding ticket while driving to work one morning. Judge Caprio listened to James's story, with the same attention he had given to Maria. James explained that he had been running late for work because his elderly mother had fallen in her bathroom and he had to help her before he could leave for his job. "I know I shouldn't have been speeding," James told the judge, "but I was worried about my mother and I was also worried about being late for work. My boss doesn't like it when we're late." Judge Caprio asked James about his mother's condition and his work situation. James explained that his mother was 85 years old and lived alone. He checked on her every morning before work to make sure she was okay. Richard Walsh rolled his eyes. Here was another sob story. Another person making excuses for breaking the law. Richard looked around the courtroom and saw that other people were listening to James with sympathy and understanding. Judge Caprio decided to reduce James's fine from $150 to $50. He explained that James was a good son who was taking care of his elderly mother, and that counted for something in his courtroom. "Thank you, Your Honor," James said with relief. "I really appreciate your understanding." Richard had heard enough. He stood up suddenly from his seat in the back row. The movement was so quick and unexpected that several people turned to look at him. "This is ridiculous," Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet courtroom. Everyone in the courtroom turned to stare at him. Judge Caprio looked up from his papers with surprise. Officer Rodriguez immediately stepped forward, ready to handle any trouble. "Sir, please sit down," Officer Rodriguez said firmly. "Court is in session." But Richard was too angry to sit down. All of his frustration from the past hour came pouring out at once. "I've been sitting here for over an hour listening to this nonsense," Richard yelled, pointing toward the front of the courtroom. "Everyone who comes up here has some excuse for why they broke the law, and this judge just lets them all off the hook." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even James, who was still standing at the defendant's podium, turned around to see what was happening. Judge Caprio remained calm. He had dealt with angry people in his courtroom before, though it didn't happen very often. He knew that the best way to handle these situations was to stay calm and not let emotions take over. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice and sit down," Judge Caprio said in a steady voice. "If you have something to say, you'll have your turn when your case is called." But Richard was beyond listening to reason. He was angry and he wanted everyone to know it. "My case should have been called an hour ago," Richard shouted. "Instead, I'm sitting here watching you run a charity instead of a courtroom. Some of us actually follow the law and pay our taxes." The people in the courtroom started to murmur among themselves. They couldn't believe that someone was yelling at Judge Caprio, who was known for being one of the fairest and kindest judges in the state. Maria Santos, who was still sitting in the front row, looked scared. She felt terrible that someone was so upset about the judge helping her. She wondered if she should have just paid her fine and not told her story. Richard continued his rant, his face getting redder with each word. "I have important business to take care of. I don't have time to sit here all day listening to people make excuses. This is exactly what's wrong with the system. Officer Rodriguez took another step toward Richard. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down and be quiet. If you don't, you're going to be removed from the courtroom. I'll be quiet when someone starts doing their job properly, Richard yelled back. Judge Caprio had remained patient through Richard's outburst, but he could see that this man was not going to calm down on his own. The judge also noticed that Richard's behavior was upsetting the other people in the courtroom. Sir, Judge Caprio said, his voice still calm but more firm now. What is your name? Richard Walsh. Richard shouted back. And I've been waiting here for over an hour to deal with a bogus parking ticket, while you hand out free passes to everyone else. Now Judge Caprio understood. This man was angry about waiting, and he was taking his frustration out on the court and on the people who had come before him. Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio said, I understand that you're frustrated about waiting, but that doesn't give you the right to disrupt my courtroom or to disrespect the people here. Richard wasn't listening. He was too caught up in his anger to hear what the judge was saying. This bleeding heart nonsense is exactly why this city is going to hell, Richard yelled, his voice getting even louder. You're supposed to enforce the law, not make exceptions for everyone who comes in here with a sad story. That was the moment when Richard Walsh crossed a line that should never be crossed. He was about to say something that would change everything. Richard Walsh's face was now bright red with anger. His expensive suit was wrinkled from sitting too long, and his perfectly styled hair was starting to look messy. He had completely lost control of his temper, and he didn't care who was watching. The entire courtroom was staring at him now. Some people looked shocked. Others looked disgusted. A few people were shaking their heads in disapproval. But Richard didn't notice any of this. All he could think about was his anger and frustration. Judge Caprio was still sitting calmly at his bench, watching Richard with a steady gaze. The judge had seen many different types of people in his 37 years on the bench. He had seen scared teenagers, angry drivers, frustrated business owners, and desperate parents. But he had rarely seen someone lose control like this in his courtroom. Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio said again, his voice still patient but with a warning tone. I need you to control yourself and sit down. Your behavior is inappropriate and disruptful to this court. But Richard was beyond caring about appropriate behavior. He was a successful businessman who was used to getting his way. He was used to people listening to him and doing what he wanted. The fact that this judge was not bowing down to his demands made him even angrier. Don't tell me what's inappropriate, Richard yelled, pointing his finger directly at Judge Caprio. What's inappropriate is the way you're running this courtroom. Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, had never seen anything like this in all her 20 years of working in the court. She looked at Officer Rodriguez, who was getting ready to physically remove Richard from the courtroom if necessary. Judge Caprio raised his hand slightly, signaling to Officer Rodriguez to wait a moment. The judge wanted to give Richard one more chance to calm down and behave like a civilized person. Mr. Walsh, the judge said, I can see that you're upset about having to wait. I understand that your time is valuable, but everyone's time is valuable, including the time of the people who came before you. Richard laughed bitterly. Oh, so now you're going to lecture me about time? I've been sitting here for over an hour watching you waste everyone's time with your feel-good nonsense. The people in the courtroom were getting more and more uncomfortable. They had come to court expecting a normal legal proceeding, not a shouting match. Some of them were starting to look toward the exits, wondering if they should leave. Maria Santos was still sitting in the front row, and she felt terrible about what was happening. She blamed herself for Richard's outburst. If she hadn't told her story about her daughter being sick, maybe this man wouldn't be so angry. I'm sorry, she whispered to the woman sitting next to her. I think this is my fault. Don't you dare apologize, the woman whispered back. This man's behavior has nothing to do with you. He's just showing everyone what kind of person he really is. Judge Caprio could see that Maria was upset, and that made him even more concerned about Richard's behavior. The judge's first responsibility was to maintain order in his courtroom and to protect everyone who came there seeking justice. Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio said, his voice becoming more firm, you are disrupting these proceedings and making other people uncomfortable. I'm going to ask you one final time to sit down and wait quietly for your case to be called. Richard looked around the courtroom and saw all the faces staring at him. Instead of feeling embarrassed by his behavior, he felt justified. In his mind, All of these people were just like the ones who had come before the judge, people looking for handouts and special treatment. "You know what?" Richard said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I'm tired of this whole charade. You want to know what I really think?" Judge Caprio didn't answer. He could sense that Richard was about to say something that would make this situation much worse. "I think you're nothing but a soft old man who's lost touch with reality," Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the courtroom. "You're sitting up there playing favorites and handing out free passes like you're some kind of saint." The courtroom gasped. Several people shook their heads in disbelief. Even James Mitchell, who was still standing at the defendant's podium waiting for his case to be finished, looked shocked by Richard's words. But Richard wasn't done yet. He had held in his anger for over an hour, and now it was all coming out at once. "You're supposed to be a judge, not a social worker," Richard continued, his voice getting louder with each word. "People like her," he pointed at Maria, "break the law and then come in here with their sob stories and you just eat it up." Maria felt like she wanted to disappear. She had never been so embarrassed in her life. All she had done was tell the truth about her situation, and now this man was attacking her and the judge who had helped her. "Mr. Walsh, that's enough," Judge Caprio said, his voice now carrying clear authority. "You are out of line." "Out of line?" Richard laughed harshly. "I'll tell you what's out of line. What's out of line is sitting here watching you make a mockery of the legal system." Officer Rodriguez had heard enough. He started walking toward Richard, ready to escort him out of the courtroom. But Richard saw him coming and held up his hand. "Don't worry, I'm not done yet," Richard said with a nasty smile. "I've got more to say about this joke of a courtroom." The tension in the room was thick. Everyone could feel that something terrible was about to happen. Judge Caprio sat perfectly still, watching Richard with calm eyes, but everyone could see that the judge's patience was running out. Richard looked directly at Judge Caprio, and what came out of his mouth next shocked everyone in the courtroom. "You know what your problem is, old man," Richard said with pure venom in his voice. "You're nothing but a bleeding heart fool who thinks he can solve everyone's problems with a pat on the head and a free pass." The insult hung in the air like a dark cloud. The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear people breathing. Everyone was waiting to see how Judge Caprio would respond to being called a fool in his own courtroom. But Richard wasn't finished. He was about to say something that would cross every line of decency and respect. "No wonder people think judges are jokes," Richard shouted, pointing his finger directly at Judge Caprio's face. "You should retire before you embarrass yourself any further. You're an embarrassment to the legal profession." That was it. Richard Walsh had just insulted Judge Frank Caprio in the worst possible way, in front of a courtroom full of people. He had questioned the judge's competence, called him a fool, and suggested that he was too old and incompetent to do his job. The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone was staring at Richard in complete disbelief. Even Officer Rodriguez stopped walking, stunned by what he had just heard. Judge Caprio sat perfectly still for a moment, looking at Richard with an expression that no one in the courtroom had ever seen before. The kind, gentle judge they all knew was still there, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something that told everyone that Richard Walsh had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The silence in the courtroom was complete. It was the kind of silence that happens when something shocking has just occurred, and everyone is trying to process what they have witnessed. Even the old building itself seemed to be holding its breath. Judge Frank Caprio sat at his bench looking directly at Richard Walsh. The judge's face had changed completely. The gentle, grandfatherly expression that everyone knew was gone. In its place was something much more serious and commanding. For 37 years, Judge Caprio had been insulted, challenged, and disrespected by people who came through his courtroom. But he had never been spoken to with such pure contempt and arrogance. Richard Walsh had crossed a line that should never be crossed. The transformation in Judge Caprio was remarkable to watch. The soft-spoken man who had just shown such kindness to Maria Santos was gone. In his place sat a judge who had decades of experience dealing with people who thought they were above the law and above common decency. When Judge Caprio finally spoke, his voice was completely different. It was no longer warm and gentle. It was the voice of authority. It was the voice of someone who had presided over thousands of cases and had seen every type of human behavior imaginable. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Caprio said, his voice cutting through the silence like a sword. In 37 years on this bench, I have learned many things about human nature. Richard was still standing there with his arms crossed, thinking he had made his point. He expected the judge to get angry and start yelling back at him. But Judge Caprio wasn't yelling. He was speaking in a calm, measured tone that was somehow much more frightening than any shouting could have been. I have learned, Judge Caprio continued, that a person's true character is revealed not in their moments of triumph, but in how they treat other people when they think no one important is watching. The people in the courtroom were hanging on every word. They could see that something significant was happening. This wasn't just a judge dealing with a disruptive person. This was a master of human nature about to give a lesson that nobody would ever forget. You, sir, Judge Caprio said, looking directly into Richard's eyes, have just revealed your character to everyone in this courtroom. Richard's confident expression started to change. For the first time since his outburst began, he was beginning to realize that maybe he had made a mistake. The way Judge Caprio was looking at him and speaking to him was unlike anything he had expected. You assume that I don't know the law because I choose to show compassion. Judge Caprio continued. You assume that kindness is weakness and that mercy is foolishness. The judge's voice was getting stronger with each sentence. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the power behind his words. But I assume something different about you, Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio said. I assume that you don't know what humanity means because you have chosen cruelty over kindness. I assume that you have forgotten what it means to care about other people. Richard's mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He was beginning to understand that he was not in control of this situation anymore. You see Mrs. Santos over there, Judge Caprio said, gesturing toward Maria, and you see weakness. You see someone who deserves to be punished for making a difficult choice in a difficult situation. Maria was looking down at her hands, still feeling embarrassed by all the attention. But Judge Caprio wasn't done defending her. But I see a mother who put her child's life before her own convenience, the judge continued. I see a woman who works 60 hours a week to support her family. I see someone who made a mistake but took responsibility for it and fixed it as soon as she could. The contrast between Judge Caprio's view of Maria and Richard's view was becoming crystal clear to everyone in the courtroom. You look at Mr. Mitchell, Judge Caprio said, nodding toward James, who was still standing at the defendant's podium, and you see someone making excuses for breaking the law. James looked uncomfortable being brought into this confrontation, but he listened respectfully. But I see a son who takes care of his elderly mother every single day, Judge Caprio continued. I see a man who is torn between following the speed limit and helping someone he loves. I see someone who accepts responsibility for his actions and is willing to pay the consequences. Richard was starting to shift nervously from one foot to the other. The confident businessman who had been yelling just moments before was beginning to look very small and very foolish. You think that showing compassion makes me weak? Judge Caprio said, his voice rising slightly. You think that understanding people's situations makes me unfit to be a judge? The judge paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. But let me tell you what I think, Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio continued. I think that your inability to show empathy for other human beings makes you unfit to be part of any community. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of Judge Caprio's voice. Even Officer Rodriguez was listening with fascination as the judge delivered what was clearly going to be an unforgettable response. You stand there in your expensive suit, checking your expensive watch, thinking that your time is more valuable than everyone else's time. Judge Caprio said, You think that your success gives you the right to look down on people who are struggling? Richard's face was no longer red with anger. Now it was starting to turn pale as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. But success without compassion is just selfishness with money, Judge Caprio continued. Wealth without wisdom is just greed with better clothes. The judge was just getting started. He had more to say, and everyone in the courtroom knew that Richard Walsh was about to receive a lesson he would never forget. You called me a soft old man, Judge Caprio said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. You suggested that I should retire because I show mercy to people who deserve it. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly in his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice was like steel. Well, Mr. Walsh, let me show you what this soft old man can do when someone crosses the line in his courtroom. Judge Caprio stood up slowly from his chair. In all his years as a judge, He rarely stood up during proceedings unless it was to leave the courtroom. But this moment called for something more than sitting behind his desk. This moment required the full presence and authority of someone who had dedicated his life to justice. When Judge Caprio stood up, he seemed taller and more imposing than anyone had ever seen him before. His black robe flowed around him like a symbol of the law itself. Richard Walsh suddenly looked very small standing there in the middle of the courtroom. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Caprio said, his voice echoing through the quiet room, "you have made several serious mistakes today. But your biggest mistake was thinking that kindness is the same thing as weakness." The judge walked around from behind his bench and stepped down to the main floor of the courtroom. This was almost unheard of in Judge Caprio's courtroom. When he did this, everyone knew that something very important was happening. "You see, Mr. Walsh," Judge Caprio continued, now standing just a few feet away from Richard, "I don't show compassion because I don't know the law. I show compassion because I understand the law better than you ever will." Richard was now looking very uncomfortable. He kept glancing toward the exit as if he was thinking about trying to leave. But Officer Rodriguez was positioned near the door, and Richard knew there was no escape from this situation. "The law isn't just a set of rules written on paper," Judge Caprio explained, his voice carrying throughout the courtroom. "The law is supposed to serve justice, and justice isn't always the same thing as punishment." The people in the courtroom were witnessing something extraordinary. They were seeing a master teacher explain the difference between following rules blindly and using wisdom to make fair decisions. "When Mrs. Santos came before me today, I had to decide what justice looked like in her situation," Judge Caprio continued. "I could have blindly applied the rule and made her pay a fine that would have hurt her family. Or I could have used my judgment to find a better solution." Maria Santos was watching this with amazement. She had never expected that her case would lead to such a powerful lesson about justice and humanity. "That's what judges are supposed to do, Mr. Walsh," Judge Caprio said, looking directly at Richard. "We're supposed to use our experience and our wisdom to make decisions that serve justice, not just rules." Richard tried to speak. "But the law says—" "Don't interrupt me," Judge Caprio said firmly. "You've had your chance to speak, and you used it to embarrass yourself and insult this court. Now it's my turn." The authority in Judge Caprio's voice was absolute. Richard immediately closed his mouth and looked down at the floor. "You want to talk about the law?" Judge Caprio continued. "Let me teach you something about the law that you clearly don't understand." The judge walked back toward his bench but remained standing. "The law gives me the discretion to dismiss cases when justice is better served by mercy," Judge Caprio explained. "The law gives me the power to reduce fines when circumstances call for it. The law allows me to consider the whole person, not just their violation." Richard was starting to look very worried now. He was beginning to understand that his outburst might have serious consequences. "But the law also gives me other powers, Mr. Walsh," Judge Caprio said, his voice taking on a more ominous tone. "Powers that I rarely have to use because most people who come to my courtroom behave with basic decency and respect." Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to Richard, sensing that Judge Caprio was about to exercise one of those powers. "The law gives me the power to hold people in contempt of court when they disrupt proceedings and show disrespect for the judicial process," Judge Caprio continued. "The law gives me the power to fine people who think they can come into my courtroom and act however they want." Richard's eyes grew wide as he realized what was happening. "Mr. Walsh, you are now in contempt of this court," Judge Caprio announced. "Your behavior has been disruptful, inappropriate, and completely unacceptable." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Everyone knew that being held in contempt of court was serious business. It meant fines, and it could even mean jail time. "But I'm not done yet," Judge Caprio said, raising his hand to quiet the room. "You see, you also have your own case to deal with today. That parking ticket you've been so eager to fight." Richard had completely forgotten about his parking ticket. All he could think about now was the contempt charge and what it might mean for him. "Officer Rodriguez," Judge Caprio called out, "please escort Mr. Walsh to the defendant's table. He's going to get his day in court after all." Officer Rodriguez walked over to Richard and gestured for him to move to the front of the courtroom, where defendants normally stood. Richard's legs felt shaky as he walked to the defendant's table. "Now, Mr. Walsh," Judge Caprio said, sitting back down at his bench and picking up Richard's case file. Let's discuss your parking violation. Richard stood at the defendant's table feeling completely different than he had just minutes before. When he had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, he had felt angry and superior. Now he felt small and scared. According to this citation, Judge Caprio said, reading from the file, you parked in a loading zone on Westminster Street for 15 minutes while you had lunch. Richard nodded weakly. Yes, Your Honor. And you believe this citation was issued unfairly? Judge Caprio asked. Well, Richard started to say, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. I thought the sign wasn't clear. I see, Judge Caprio said, looking at the photographs that had been taken by the parking officer. But looking at these photos, the sign seems quite clear to me. It says loading zone, no parking 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. Richard could see the photos from where he was standing. The sign was clearly visible and easy to read. Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio continued, you parked illegally because you thought the rules didn't apply to you. You came to my courtroom thinking you could disrupt proceedings because you thought your time was more important than everyone else's time. The judge looked directly at Richard, who was now sweating despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. Unlike Mrs. Santos, who broke the law because she was trying to save her child's life, you broke the law because it was convenient for you, Judge Caprio said. Unlike Mr. Mitchell, who was speeding because he was helping his elderly mother, you were thinking only of yourself. Richard wanted to argue, but he knew that anything he said would only make things worse. The fine for parking in a loading zone is $75, Judge Caprio said, but given your behavior in my courtroom today, and your obvious contempt for the legal process, I'm doubling that fine to $150. Richard's mouth fell open. He had come to court hoping to get his ticket dismissed, and now he had to pay twice as much as the original fine. Additionally, Judge Caprio continued, you are fined another $200 for contempt of court. The total was now $350. Richard had turned a $75 parking ticket into a $350 lesson in respect and humility. Richard Walsh stood at the defendant's table, staring down at the floor in complete shock. His expensive suit suddenly felt heavy on his shoulders, and his gold watch seemed to mock him with every tick. The confident businessman who had walked into the courtroom that morning was gone, replaced by someone who looked defeated and embarrassed. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in slowly. Richard had come to court to fight a $75 parking ticket. Instead, he now owed $350 in fines. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was knowing that everyone in the courtroom had seen him make a complete fool of himself. Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio said from his bench, his voice now calm but still carrying authority. Do you understand the charges against you? Richard nodded without looking up. Yes, Your Honor, he said quietly. And do you understand why you are being held in contempt of court? Yes, Your Honor, Richard repeated, his voice barely audible. Judge Caprio studied Richard's face for a moment. The judge could see that Richard was genuinely shaken by what had happened. This was good. It meant that maybe, just maybe, Richard had learned something from this experience. Mr. Walsh, Judge Caprio said, I want you to understand something. The reason I dismissed Mrs. Santos's case was not because I don't believe in the law. I dismissed it because the law allows judges to use discretion when circumstances call for it. Richard listened without speaking. Mrs. Santos made a mistake, but she made it for the right reasons, Judge Caprio continued. You made a mistake and you made it for selfish reasons. That's the difference. The courtroom was still completely quiet. Everyone was listening to Judge Caprio's final words to Richard. I hope you will think about what happened here today, Judge Caprio said. I hope you will remember that showing compassion to others doesn't make a person weak. It makes them human. Richard finally looked up at Judge Caprio. For the first time since his outburst began, he seemed to really see the judge as a person instead of just an obstacle to getting what he wanted. Your Honor, Richard said, his voice shaking slightly. I apologize for my behavior. I was wrong to speak to you that way. Judge Caprio nodded. Apology accepted, Mr. Walsh, but actions have consequences, and you will still need to pay the fines. I understand, Richard said. Officer Rodriguez approached Richard with the paperwork for his fines. Richard took the papers with trembling hands. As he looked at the total amount he owed, he realized that this was the most expensive lunch break he had ever taken. But as Richard walked toward the back of the courtroom to leave, something unexpected happened. The people who had been sitting near him started to clap. At first it was just a few people, then more joined in. Soon the entire courtroom was applauding, but they weren't clapping for Richard. They were clapping for Judge Caprio. Maria Santos was clapping with tears of gratitude in her eyes. James Mitchell was clapping with relief that someone had stood up for decent people, everywhere. Mrs. Patterson was clapping with pride, for the judge she had worked with for so many years. Even some of the people who were waiting for their own cases to be called were clapping. They had just witnessed something special. They had seen justice delivered with wisdom, compassion, and strength. Judge Caprio smiled and nodded his thanks to the people in the courtroom. This was why he had become a judge in the first place. Not for moments like Richard's outburst, but for moments like Maria's relief and James's gratitude. As the applause died down, Richard Walsh made his way to the exit. His face was red again, but this time it was from embarrassment instead of anger. He had to walk past all the people who had witnessed his meltdown and Judge Caprio's response. Some people looked at him with disappointment. Others looked at him with something that might have been pity. A few people just looked away, as if they were embarrassed for him. Richard reached the courtroom door and paused for a moment. He looked back at Judge Caprio one last time. The judge was already moving on to the next case, treating the next defendant with the same respect and attention he gave to everyone. As Richard left the courthouse, he couldn't stop thinking about what Judge Caprio had said. The judge's words kept echoing in his head. Success without compassion is just selfishness with money. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, life was returning to normal. Judge Caprio finished James Mitchell's case, giving him the reduced fine and a few words of encouragement about taking care of his mother. "Next case," Mrs. Patterson called out. Maria Santos gathered her purse and prepared to leave the courtroom. As she stood up, several people patted her on the back and wished her well. The woman who had been sitting next to her gave her a hug. "You take care of yourself and that little girl," the woman said. "Judge Caprio was right about you. You're a good mother." Maria smiled through her tears. "Thank you. Today has been incredible." As Maria walked toward the exit, she stopped at Judge Caprio's bench. The judge was reviewing the next case, but he looked up when he saw her approaching. "Your Honor," Maria said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you one more time. You don't know how much your kindness means to me and Emma." Judge Caprio smiled warmly. "You're very welcome, Mrs. Santos. You take care of yourself and remember what I said." "You're not alone." Maria nodded and walked toward the exit. As she passed the spot where Richard Walsh had been standing during his outburst, she thought about how different two people could be. Richard had everything: money, success, power, but he had used it to tear others down. Judge Caprio had power too, but he used it to lift people up. As Maria left the courthouse, she pulled out her phone and called her daughter's school. "Hi, this is Maria Santos," she said when the secretary answered. "Could you give Emma a message for me? Tell her that Mommy had a very good day today, and everything is going to be okay." Later that afternoon, a court reporter named Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Richard, was transcribing the morning's proceedings. She had been the court reporter in Judge Caprio's courtroom for 5 years, and she had seen many memorable cases. But she had never seen anything quite like what had happened with Richard Walsh. As Jennifer typed up the transcript, she found herself smiling at Judge Caprio's words. She knew that this transcript would be requested by many people who had heard about what happened. Word was already spreading around the courthouse about the businessman who had insulted Judge Caprio and gotten destroyed in return. By the end of the day, someone had uploaded a video of the incident to social media. The video had been taken by a law student who was observing court proceedings for a class project. Within hours, the video had thousands of views. By the next morning, it had millions. People from all over the country were sharing the video and commenting on it. Most of the comments praised Judge Caprio for his wisdom and his compassion. Many people shared their own stories about times when a judge or other authority figure had shown them kindness when they needed it most. The video became a symbol of what the justice system could be at its best: fair, wise, and human. Richard Walsh saw the video too. A friend sent it to him with a message that said, "Dude, isn't this you?" Watching himself on video was even more painful than experiencing it in person. Richard could see how arrogant and cruel he had looked. He could see how patient and dignified Judge Caprio had been, even in the face of such disrespect. For the first time in his life, Richard Walsh felt truly ashamed of himself. The next morning, Richard did something he had never done before. He wrote a letter. "Dear Judge Caprio," the letter began, "I am writing to apologize for my behavior in your courtroom yesterday. Watching the video of what happened has shown me how wrong I was, not just about you, but about what it means to be a decent human being." The letter went on for 2 pages. Richard apologized not just to Judge Caprio but to Maria Santos, James Mitchell, and everyone else in the courtroom who had witnessed his outburst. "I realize now that you weren't being soft or weak," Richard wrote. "You were being wise and compassionate. I hope someday I can learn to be more like that myself." Richard mailed the letter to the courthouse, not knowing if Judge Caprio would ever read it or respond to it. 3 days later, Richard received a phone call at his office. "Mr. Walsh, this is Judge Caprio." Richard's heart started beating fast. "Yes, Your Honor." "I got your letter," Judge Caprio said. "I wanted to call and thank you for writing it. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I respect that." Richard felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for calling, Your Honor. I meant every word I wrote." "I believe you did," Judge Caprio replied. "Mr. Walsh, we all make mistakes. The important thing is what we learn from them. I hope this experience will help you become the person you want to be." After that phone call, Richard Walsh was never quite the same person he had been before. He still owned his successful restaurants and he still made good money. But he started treating his employees better. He started donating money to help single mothers like Maria Santos. And he never again assumed that his time was more important than anyone else's. The video of Judge Caprio's response to Richard Walsh continued to be watched and shared for years to come. It became a reminder that wisdom, compassion, and strength could exist together in the same person. And in Providence, Rhode Island, Judge Frank Caprio continued to do